Everybody knew then that Richard Cambion's soul was unquiet, and when a soul is quite unquiet, you have to be careful what you do, it is said, with their bodies. So what they did with Richard Cambion's body was they took it and lay it in the family tomb, but put 13 great locks, made by a famous magician, all around it. And the years went by, and knowledge of these things faded into the grass. There just became one silly little custom around Whitsuntide. All the young men of the village and the young women would get really, really drunk, and then they would go up to the family tomb of the Cambions and shout, "Richard, Richard, it's so much nicer outside than in, ha ha ha!" Well, one year, 200 years or more after Richard Cambion died, it happened that 13 merrymakers went up to the tomb. And they all called out the normal chant, "Richard, it's so much nicer outside. Don't you want to be out here?" And then one, a joker, said, "And why don't you pray come outside then?" When he said that, there was suddenly a sound. None of them could agree what it was. Maybe it was just tools falling from the roof. Or maybe it was a sound of thunder. Or the more fanciful said, it sounded like the very gates of hell were opening. But they all ran. 13 souls ran terrified down from the church up by Buckfastleigh. But only 12 came home safe and sound. For the 13th, the joker was found the next day, his neck broken. He had fallen from the high cliff that stands this day up by Buckfastleigh Church. Well, from that time, in all the neighbourhood of Buckfastleigh, there was a happiness that hung over the fields. It felt like a plague. It started also to affect the animals. First, the pigs and the sheep seemed to grow listless, and then the cattle, and when you slaughtered them, there seemed to be less blood than there should be in the beasts. Now it moved at last to the people. It first happened in the long house of Richard Cambion. That house had been deserted for some time, the Cambions having moved down to a new, far more commodious house and abandoning the long house. I'm still getting that background hiss. Are you getting that background hiss? Are we thinking that background hiss might be genuine? Sorry to interrupt the tale like this. It's just very bad, my background hiss. And I will carry on now. My good colleague Gwydsyth will see what she can do about it. As it happened, the house of the Cambions had been rented by 2 brothers and their sister. Their sister was a wild, romantic woman. A wild woman who was famous for reading Mrs. Radcliffe and for her enjoyment of life. And so it was, she never, ever drew the curtains or the blinds. One time, she went to bed. Now it was near midsummer, and she looked out on the blue of the evening and thought to herself, My, this is nice out there. And as she looked out, it seemed to her that there were 2 pinpricks as if they might be stars, up by the walls where she knew stars should not be. And she thought to herself, I wonder, they look like eyes. But then she thought to herself, what idle fancy is that? But she just drew the curtains, leaving the window quite unlocked, and went to bed with a copy of Mrs. Radcliffe's Adolfo to read. And she read it in happiness, and went to sleep, still reading. How long she slept, she never knew. She woke up in the middle of the night, it seemed to her. Her candle had burned quite low, but the moon was flooding in from the window, and by its silvery light she looked outside, and there she saw, hunched up against the window, was a figure with 2 shining, bright eyes, and as she watched, the window was suddenly pulled open, and something came in. It leapt across the room, and it beat before she could do anything, before she could cry out into her throat. She suddenly cried out in agony, and her brothers, hearing that, woke up and came running down the corridor. Their noise clattering along the corridor that was quite uncarpeted. And the creature, hearing that, ran out, and so it was, when they came inside, there was an empty room. And in that empty room, they saw only their sister lying, her throat bleeding, Well, she could not give a full account about what happened. Some people said it was madmen. Other people said it must have been a wild dog or just something. Something was loose. But the brothers weren't risking any more of it. They took their sister and they went travelling, following Mrs. Adolfo's path, down to Switzerland and in Italy. But it was the sister, who had been born and bred in Devon, who insisted that they came home. And so it was. They came home around the turning of the year, around October-tide. But they came home to a countryside that was quite different. It was as if the terror had moved into all the cottages and all the houses, all through the edge of the moor. It was said the plague was inflicting children now. Many were found listless, and old women said things were scuttling like crabs or spiders in the farmyards, and the hedgerows were alive with lanterns. The girl and the brothers laughed, all save the eldest brother, who insisted they all had a pistol down by their beds, and made sure everyone locked the shutters. Well, it was Hallows Eve, and the girl went to bed, locking the shadows, laughing at her brother's folly, and went to sleep as best she could. But again she woke up, and this time there was a sound, an absolute sound, a sound coming from the window. Pick, pick, pick it went, pick, 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 insistent, more insistent as she awoke. And she looked out the window and saw through the shutters. There were the two shining eyes. She remembered, but she thought to herself, but I have the shutters shut. But as she watched and wondered what the sound was, she suddenly realised. Pig, pig, pig! The long, thin fingers of the creature were long enough and thin enough to go through the shuttered windows, and they were picking away the lead, the soft lead that guarded the fanlight. And as she walked in silent horror, suddenly the last of the lead on the glass came off, and the fingers crept inside the window, forced the shutter lock open, and suddenly the window standed open wide, and the cold wind blew into the room, and the creature jumped once more into her room. But as it jumped, the girl remembered the pistol her brother had put by the bed, and she shot, and by more by chance than by skill she hit it as it jumped, catching it in the chest, and it howled with fury, and her brothers, hearing that, came running down the corridor, through the open door, and there they saw it crouching like a wounded spider. But as they came in, it ran out across the garden, and the brothers paused, seeing their sister was okay, before they ran out into the garden, and so could not see it, although the garden was full of a moonlight. Then the eldest brother, looking around, saw at last, up by the high garden wall, there seemed to be a figure. Now it was a long shot, but the moon was shining quite bright. So he raised his pistol and fired, and a cold howl came across the wind. And he ran up to the wall as fast as he could, and looked over the silver light to the churchyard, and saw nothing. But it seemed to him there was a movement. Perhaps it was a door closing up into the tomb of the Cambions. And so it was, he and his brother and the sexton, and all those who were brave, went to the old crypt of the Cambions the next day. And there were all the tombs of the Cambions, lying there, but all safe as they'd always been, save one, the tomb of Richard Cambion. And around it was the great lock that had been opened, and they opened up the coffin lid and looked inside, and there was the withered form of a vampire, and on its chest was a bloody mark, the mark of a bullet. Well, they knew what they had found, and they took it and burned it to that very day, and then they locked Richard Campbell's ashes in a great sarcophagi, and they put that sarcophagi in Buckfastleigh Church, and all around it they put those sharp railings we know to this day to keep his unquiet